All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show, and I have a lot of news to talk about on today's show. It will just be me solo. I know I've had guests on quite a few of the most recent shows, and we will get back to guests soon. If anybody has a suggestion on somebody they would like me to interview, head on over to the YouTube channel and subscribe, and then leave us a comment. Always interested to know who people might think I could have an interesting conversation with. Additionally, if you have questions or other comments, we're happy to hear them. We're also streaming live on X, and so no matter where you are listening, whether that's on YouTube or X, go ahead and repost, get this show out there to a few more listeners, and let's go ahead and jump into the news that I have today. Now, this first story I think is really important, and it started to come out last week. It initially broke with a Jewish Insider article titled "Netanyahu Pushes Back on Anti-Israel Trends in Meeting with Podcasters." And so the article explains that Netanyahu tried to push back against anti-Israel trends in the right-wing media world by holding a briefing on Monday in the Blair House for podcasters and other media figures, sources in the meeting told Jewish Insider on Tuesday. Among those in attendance were podcasters including Dave Rubin, Tim Pool, and former White House press secretary Sean Spicer, writers Brittany Mandel and David J. Harris, influencers Jessica Krause, and senior editor Seth Mandel, and Federalist and editor-in-chief Molly Hemingway. And so I want to focus on Tim Pool a little bit here. And during the meeting, he said he expressed comments about increased anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the pro-Trump podcasting space, according to one source in the room. Responding to Pool, Netanyahu said the reason he has invited the group to meet with him. Poole asked if there was a Qatari opt to manipulate social media algorithms to make anti-Semitic and anti-Israel episodes appear to receive an outside number of views in order to incentivize podcasters and YouTubers to produce more anti-Semitic content. And so I think this is a really big and a really important story for a number of reasons that we're going to get into. And the first is to just focus on the fact that this meeting had to take place in the first place. For decades upon decades, right-wing support for Israel in the United States was just guaranteed. You can absolutely take it to the bank that there is going to be massive right-wing support for Israel. But last week we had a new Pew poll out, and this was something that we've seen from other polls showing it again and again and again. And what this poll showed is that not just Democrats, and in the vast number, an overwhelming number of Democrats, now a majority of Americans, do not support Israel, but also about 50% of Republicans under the age of 50 do not support Israel. Now, the Republicans over the age of 50, their views on Israel really haven't shifted. And of course, I think the obvious reason why, and what people would identify and point to, is that the older generation, those older the age of 50, are the ones who are still consuming their media through the traditional methods. So they're, watching Fox News, maybe CNN, or any of the other mainstream news networks, where you really don't get the same kind of just raw content, raw news that you do when you get your media online through YouTube shows like this one, through Timcast, Tim Pool's show, Dave Rubin's show. All of these other shows have so much influence among those under the age of 50. And so with Israel's support plummeting in the United States, they need to start talking to right-wing media influencers who are still pro-Israel, like Tim Pool, to try to get them to ramp up and tailor their message. And so I think that's the most important part of all of this, that Israel felt that this meeting had to happen in the first place. Now I want to get into the next piece of this, and we actually have Tim Pool's statement on this meeting with Netanyahu.
Last night I wasn't here. I got late word that I was invited to a private roundtable meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It was under what's called Chatham House rules. For those that are not familiar, this means that you cannot reveal anybody who attended, nor attribute anything to any one individual, as they can deny it, and they would. However, what I love about what the White House is currently doing, when you bring together a bunch of influencers and podcasters who don't know much about journalism culture, whatever you want to call it, not that we respect it tremendously, most people didn't know what Chatham House meant. So with all due respect, it's funny because they bring us into the Blair House, which is where Netanyahu was staying. And immediately people are walking around with their cameras, their phones up. They actually took our phones from us. And I legit thought they would maintain Chatham House rules, meaning you can't quote the prime minister, you can't quote his officials and the other people who were there, but you can report what was said generally. If you wanted an official quote on a specific matter, you would then ask an official once the meeting was wrapped, and they'd provide you the exact quote. Or they would just say outright, like, we ain't putting our quotes on that one.
So the next piece of this is Tim Pool's reaction. And I think this is telling as well and represents a trend where for a long time, the independent media really represented something entirely different than the mainstream media, that they didn't play by the same old rules as the mainstream media. And this allowed them to be so much better than the mainstream media. But what Tim Pool is saying here is he's describing the process that he's undergoing, and others like Dave Rubin, who would be, formerly considered as part of the right-wing independent media, who are now really putting and becoming the mainstream media, right? I'm not saying that it's necessarily wrong for Tim Pool to have gone to this meeting, but for him to go to this meeting and not talk to his audience about it, for him, this only came out because Jewish Insider reported it and reported on what he said, not because Tim Pool ever planned to bring this to his audience. And I think that's a really important trend that we're seeing here among the right-wing media, where yes, some of the independent media are remaining independent. A lot of podcasters always just retain their personality, and that's what makes the world of independent media so great. Is somebody like Joe Rogan can just be Joe Rogan and doesn't have to conform to the CNN narrative on whatever new virus or tariff policy comes about. He could just interview and talk to who he wants to interview. And so some people do continue to go down that line. We see this with somebody like Candace Owens, who's constantly willing to step on what should be even conservative guardrails, light support for Israel, and to question how much the U.S. support the U.S. gives to Israel. But then we have other people in the podcast realm in the right wing, Ben Shapiro, Tim Pool, Dave Rubin, who don't want to talk about these issues, who don't want to go down this road, who really do represent just a new phase of the mainstream media. They still are allowing for the same mainstream narrative control. They're just doing it from a right-wing angle, and they represented a part of the independent media when the mainstream was more liberal. But now that the mainstream is shifting towards conservative, they're just becoming a part of the mainstream. And so they are not to be trusted. The people who we see now still arguing and still maintaining their principles, calling out that MAGA shouldn't mean endless U.S. support for Israel, are the right-wing influencers who you could say are not selling out and retaining their independence. Now, I want to move on to this clip from Jeffrey Sachs explaining another reason why Benjamin Netanyahu had this meeting and what they're doing here and why it's so important for Israel.
Israel could never do these wars on its own. These are American wars. America provides the financing, it provides the military backup, it provides the naval support, it provides the intelligence operations, it provides the munitions. Israel couldn't fight for one day without the United States backing.
So this is a really important point. Remember, go back to the poll we showed from Pew earlier in the episode, where support for Israel is plummeting long-term among Americans. And with that, Israel being so reliant on the United States needs to capture the support from some of America's under 50-year-old voters. And right now they're losing them. And so they're going to the places where people under the age of 50, and I know Tim Pool is considered a right-wing podcaster now, but at one point, I think he was considered a left winger that, you know, he kind of came up through the Occupy Wall Street movement and things like that. And so, you know, the shift in turns that people take politically is interesting, but for Tim Pool, there's always been pretty strong support for Israel. And so that's why I believe Israel is going down this path. They understand a few very important things. And one is that they're losing support for the Americans under the age of 50. Podcasters and YouTubers have a lot of sway with the people under the age of 50, and they need American support to continue their wars. Now, I think the good news for Israel, and it's bad news for the world, it's bad news for Palestinians' morality, is that they still have, I think, a legacy hold on the United States. You know, congressmen almost like that, you know, they're just English royalty, right? They hold on to their congressional seats for term after term after term, decade after decade after decade. They remain in the Senate or in the House. You know, a lot of these people will sit in the same seat for, you know, 20 or 30 years. And so when Israel is able to put in those pro-Israeli voices and then know that they're going to be in Congress for decades, even if the rest of America is opposed to what Israel is doing, which they are now, they still have to deal with the fact that, you know, Israel still has to deal with the fact that the majority of Americans are going to be voicing support against them. And so one of the things I think Netanyahu is looking at here is just retaining enough support among the under 50-year-old crowd. Now, I want to move on and go ahead and play this Nets clip. This is some audio that Matt Blumenthal obtained through the Gray Zone, and they did some really good reporting on this. And I know the audio is kind of hard to hear, but it's really touching on a point that I want to get into a little bit more. So let's go ahead and play this Nets clip.
We may not lobby the executive, but as we were talking about this discussion earlier about Congress being representative to the people, well, the White House has to be responsive to Congress. And so it's working with, at the time, our friends on the Democratic side of the aisle to apply pressure the way they know how to an administration, as it will be with this administration. Well, I was talking about the people who will get appointed to some of these jobs. Look at the top level, you talk about Marco Rubio, Michael Waltz. Those three people have something in common. They all serve in Congress. They all have relationships with key impact leaders in their communities.
All right, so I know that audio is a little bit hard to hear, and a big part of the reason why is because it wasn't meant to be public, because this is a big omission. AIPAC is talking about the amount of control and the influence they have in the White House. And they're saying, why do we have all that control and influence in the White House? We have that because we have so much control and influence on Capitol Hill, and now the Congress, or excuse me, the White House is pulling from Capitol Hill in order to form its national security cabinet, its top advisors. And so he points to Marco Rubio, Lee Stefanik, who was the pick to be ambassador to the UN that was rescinded, and Mike Waltz. And this is, I think, really important to understand of what AIPAC does, because it's not like elections come up where there's a Democrat and a Republican, and one is pro giving support to Israel and the other is against giving support to Israel, and then AIPAC goes and bats the candidate that's for giving support to Israel. AIPAC interferes at the primary level, right? They make sure that the candidate who wins the Democratic and the Republican primary are both pro-Israel. That way the issue never comes up for debate during the general election time, because everybody's in support of Israel. Look at the last U.S. election last time around, right? Trump attacked Biden for not being supportive enough for Israel during a period where Biden had given Israel $20 billion in military aid, just hundreds of weapon shipments, violating U.S. laws to send Israel weapons, looking the other way as Israel was conducting a genocide in Gaza. And yet Trump said, you're not supportive enough of Israel. He actually called Joe Biden on the debate stage a bad Palestinian. And he continued to criticize Kamala Harris for the same thing. And so it's so important to understand that AIPAC starts and develops candidates at the lower level. That way, whenever the president is trying to form their cabinet, they're picking of people who were already approved by AIPAC. You know, Thomas Massey has mentioned this, and I just think it's so important. He says he's the only Republican in the House of Representatives. That's, you know, well over 100 people, and he is the only one who doesn't have an AIPAC minder, somebody who says and tells Thomas Massey how to vote when it comes to issues of Israel. And that's why you often see him breaking with the Republican rest of the Republican caucus when it comes to issues involving Israel. And so one of the reasons I think that this is also important to what's happening right now on the ground in the Middle East is that Netanyahu must understand this dynamic. And I'm sure Israel is going to do what it can to try to stop the bleeding by using its influence with Dave Rubin, Tim Pool, and other right-wing influencers to try to get them to write articles more sympathetic towards Israel, give Israel more sympathetic coverage in their pages and on their shows. However, he has to understand that there really is a time clock, a time bomb in the United States politics for supporting Israel. And if he waits too long, then that could flip. And suddenly, you know, just like we were once staunchly in support of Israel, now the Americans are staunchly against Israel and not for giving Tel Aviv any more military support that, as Jeffrey Sachs explained, Israel is in desperate need of. And if they don't get that, then they're in real trouble. So I think this accelerates Netanyahu's timetable and pushes him to try to annex the West Bank, Gaza, parts of southern Lebanon, parts of southern Syria, all at the same time, because he understands he won't have a Trump administration in place forever, where essentially everybody who's in any kind of position of decision-making power when it comes to national security is somebody who's been approved by the Israel lobby. Now, before I move on to the next clip, I just want to remind everybody to share the show. We have over 100 of you watching live, and so if we could get a few more shares on X, that would be fantastic. And of course, if you want to head on over to the YouTube channel, you can make suggestions for future guests, ask questions, or just give comments on the content that we are putting out right now. So next up here, I have a couple clips of Donald Trump talking about the situation with Iran in the Oval Office. Let's play the first clip.
What specifically?
Well, they can't have a nuclear weapon.
Did you mean military action, though, if they don't agree?
Oh, if necessary? Absolutely. Yeah.
And do you have a
deadline for these
Yeah,
talks?
I do.
And
You're talking about with Iran?
Yes.
Yeah, I
They're saying
do.
it's not
Do you have something
negotiable.
definitive this weekend, or do you see this as the start of a process?
It's a start.
Do you have a timeline?
We have a little time, but we don't have much time
Who is it starting?
because we're not going to let them have a nuclear weapon.
Is
Can't
it
let them
all
have a
going to
nuclear
be there, Mr. President?
And we're going to let them thrive. I want them to thrive. I want Iran to be great.
So the biggest problem when it comes to the U.S. position on Iran and negotiating with Iran is the U.S. is essentially negotiating in an unreality, right? The U.S. intelligence community, the Iranian government, the international watchdog for nuclear programs all say Iran isn't trying to make a nuclear weapon. Everybody knows that Iran is not trying to make a nuclear weapon, but Donald Trump is going to the Iranians and saying, sign this deal saying that you're not going to make a nuclear weapon. And if that's all the agreement said, I do think the Iranians would sign it. They did so in 2015. They made a deal with Obama, and then Trump vacated that deal and imposed sanctions on Iran when they were abiding by it. But what Trump is actually on that piece of paper that Trump is giving Iran, which on the top maybe says, as he keeps saying, Iran cannot make nuclear weapons. It says Iran cannot have a nuclear program. Iran cannot have ties with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with the Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, with the Houthis in Yemen. Iran cannot have air defense programs. Iran cannot even enrich nuclear fuel, right, which is needed for basic nuclear civilian energy programs. We're saying that Iran could do none of this. And of course, to that, Tehran isn't going to comply. They're not going to go along with this. And so while what Trump is putting forward to the American people sounds very reasonable. We just don't want the Iranians to make a nuclear weapon. That's all. If the Iranians agree to that, we could make a deal with them. We got normal relations with Iran. Iran could be extremely prosperous. Things could be absolutely great for Iran. Their leaders just have to agree not to make a nuclear weapon. But he knows that the Iranian leaders aren't trying to make a nuclear weapon, and he's selling the American people a lie so that he could continue to say that there's this threat, right? If we need Iran to sign a deal saying they won't make a nuclear weapon, why would we have them do that unless Iran is trying to make a nuclear weapon? And why won't Iran sign that deal unless they're trying to make a nuclear weapon? This is what they're trying to make the American people think, the propaganda line they're trying to use, when in reality, what's going on here is that they're throwing in all these demands on top of Iran just not making a nuclear weapon. So let's move on to this next clip of Trump talking about Iran and a few other countries.
The only thing they can't have is a nuclear weapon. They understand that. You know, the people are so incredible in Iran, and they're so smart. They're very smart people. But, you know, they're in a rough situation, rough regime. But they understand, and the leaders understand. And I'm not asking for much. I don't. They can't have a nuclear weapon, and I've said that. And I was a little bit surprised because when the election was rigged, I figured they'd get the weapon because with me they were broke. They were broke. They had no money because of the sanctions. Nobody could buy oil. We did that to Venezuela just recently, and we'll do it to other countries if we have to. I want to see Russia and Ukraine make a deal. They got to make a deal. When schools get blown up and bad things happen, like I'm hearing about, it's no good. I hope we're going to make a deal with Russia and Ukraine. But with Iran, if it requires military, we're going to have military. Israel will obviously be very much involved in that. He'll be the leader of that. But nobody leads us. We do what we want to do.
When would the talks run out on the talks? When would the talks need to conclude before you might do military?
I can't really be specific, but you know, when you start talks, you know if they're going along well or not. And I would say the conclusion would be when I think they're not going along well.
So again, the main problem here is Trump isn't putting the same deal forward with the Iranians that he's actually putting forward to the American people. Now, the reason I want to play that full clip is he talks in there about how sanctions harm the economies of other countries, and he talks about Iran and Venezuela. And I think that's an interesting omission, just because a part of one of Trump's big domestic policy issues is the immigration issue, and a lot of Venezuelans are coming to the United States, and that's of course at least in large part because the U.S. taint the Venezuelan economy through Trump's maximum pressure sanctions. Now, Trump says something else that I find very interesting in there, the part about how he would have thought the Iranians would have built a nuclear bomb during the Biden administration, basically understanding how much leverage that would give Iran. Now, if he understands that, I hope he also understands that there's a chance an attack on Iran's nuclear program wouldn't work, and that Iran would go ahead and build a nuclear weapon in spite of what U.S. and Israel are doing. All right, so next up here, we have a clip from our Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. Let's play that one.
He's dead serious that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. He's said that for 20 years. He's been consistent. That is clear. But he's also dead serious that if we can't figure this out at the negotiating table, then there are other options, to include my department, to ensure that Iran never has a nuclear bomb. We hope we never get there. We really do, Maria. But what we're doing with the Houthis and what we're doing in the region, we've shown a capability to go far, to go deep, and to go big. And again, we don't want to do that. But if we have to, we will, to prevent the nuclear bomb in Iran's hands.
Okay, I had to play this clip for you because listen to how stupid this man sounds. He says, look at what's going on in Yemen and see that this means that we could do whatever we want in Iran, right? The Houthis have been under a blockade for a decade. The Houthis have been under an air war for 9 years. They haven't controlled their own country. ever, since they've taken power in 2014. They've only controlled a chunk of their country, and yet they are able to have a domestically produced drone and missile program capable of causing the United States to waste billions of dollars shooting down their drones and missiles in the Red Sea. Their drones and missiles landing in Israel. Right, the Houthis are doing this. Ansar Allah in Yemen is doing this, and the United States has not been able to stop them with hundreds of airstrikes. And so the Houthis, again, who control a small portion territorially, the majority of the Yemeni population lives there. But if you look at the amount of territory they control of the country, Yemen, it's maybe 20% of it. And under blockade, they've still managed to produce and drone and missile program that the United States, even with Trump's ramped up military campaign, even with spending billions of dollars, we cannot get rid of that program. This has been admitted to members of Pete Hegseth's own agency, to members of Congress. It was reported in the New York Times that yes, the Pentagon has spent $1 billion bombing Yemen, and they haven't done any real damage. They say their underground facilities are fortified. Well, what do you think the Iranians have? They have a massive country. They have a giant mountain range running through their territory. Their nuclear facilities are all deep underground. And so, if anything, the U.S. bombing campaign in Yemen proves the U.S. couldn't disable Iran's nuclear program and would just spark a wider war in the region, as bombing Yemen has done. So next up here, before I wrap up, I do want to talk about the situation, how talks are progressing between Ukraine and Russia. So this clip from Donald Trump.
Do you have a reaction to Russia's Palm Sunday attack on Ukraine?
I think it was terrible, and I was told they made a mistake, but I think it's a horrible thing. I think the whole war is a horrible thing. I think the war is, for that war to have started, is an abuse of power.
You said they made a mistake. You were told they made a mistake. Do you mean it was unintentional?
They made a mistake. I believe it was. Look, you're going to ask them. This is Biden's war. This is not my war. I've been here for a very short period of time. This is a war that was under Biden. He gave him billions and billions of dollars. He should have never allowed, if he had any brain, which he didn't have and doesn't have, and now it's being proven, he wouldn't have allowed that war to start. I would have absolutely not. That war would never have taken place. But remember this is Biden's war. I'm just trying to get it stopped so that we can save a lot of lives. They happen to be Ukrainian and Russian lives. But all I want to do is get it stopped.
All right, so before I break down this last clip, just want to remind people to share the show. If you're watching live on X, hit the repost button. If you are on YouTube, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We are live every Monday and Wednesday at 4:45 Eastern time, and just breaking down a bunch of really important foreign policy content. So now getting into Trump's speech, or Trump's remarks there on Air Force One, one of the things is kind of comical, and he's also right in a lot of ways, that the war in Ukraine is Joe Biden's war. This is a war the Americans chose to fight. Now, I want to point out, and I think it's important, notice that Trump never really is able to explain how he would have prevented the war in Ukraine. And sure, it was unbelievable American stupidity during the Biden administration that led to the war in Ukraine. When Russia, the Kremlin, were proposing absolutely reasonable agreements with the West and NATO to prevent the war in Ukraine from happening, their advances for diplomacy were spurred at every turn for absolutely no reason. And so, of course, this war is Biden's fault. But if you look at Trump, if you look at how he negotiates, if the Kremlin came to him with a reasonable agreement, he would probably reject it and demand something stronger, because that's what his mentality is that you can always get a better deal. And of course, his mentality wouldn't have been in 2020 to reverse course and stop providing lethal weapons to Ukraine, which he started, but rather to ramp up and provide more lethal weapons to Ukraine. And of course, one of Biden's main offensives against Russia was the economic war, and Trump loves economic wars. And so I think there's Trump could say all he wants, and it may be true that he wouldn't have bumbled and stumbled his way into the proxy war in the Ukraine the way the Joe Biden administration did. I would really love to hear him explain how that wouldn't have been the case under his administration, because it seems very likely he could have followed the exact same playbook as Joe Biden. And so he's talking about the war. He's talking about wanting to end the war. And this is all good. This is all moving in the right direction. However, I think there are a couple real traps still facing Donald Trump here. And this first one is an article I wrote for antiwar.com on Friday. U.S. and Ukrainian officials resume talks on the natural resources deal. Now, according to the New York Times, this new deal is a far stiffer bargain for the Ukrainians than the ones that was on the table at the end of February before the big Oval Office blow up between Trump, Zelensky, and J.D. Vance. That this would see the Americans take all the profits from Ukraine's natural resource sales until the U.S. has been recouped with 4% interest for all the aid that we have previously given to Ukraine. And who knows what Donald Trump thinks that number is. He has often said he thinks we have given Ukraine $350 billion in aid. I'm not sure how he comes to that number. I think the actual count is closer to 180 or 200 billion, but who knows what Donald Trump is going to be asking Ukraine for if he moves forward with that deal. And so that's a really tough bargain that he's driving with the Ukrainians. But if Zelensky accepts that deal, Zelensky had some really interesting statements in a recent interview with 60 Minutes. And one of the things that he said was, if we go down this path and the Americans don't back us and we continue to fight this war, we could be in real trouble. We could lose a lot of people in a lot of territory. And so maybe Zelensky says, well, I see what Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio and others have been talking about, that once Trump has an economic incentive in defending Ukraine, if he says that those rare minerals in Donetsk, in Zaporizhia, in Kherson are going to end up in the profits in the U.S. Treasury, or, in the bank accounts of some rich American businessman, then maybe he's willing to give Ukraine weapons to defend that territory. That's a real concern that I have. Now, another concern that I have, and when it comes to ending the war, is the Europeans effectively getting in the way. One of the things that Donald Trump is going to need to do is get Zelensky in line with whatever deal that he comes up with. But if Zelensky could turn to the Europeans, and Europe just pledged $23 billion in military aid to support Ukraine, then Zelensky could hold out longer and will not be susceptible to any pressure that could be put on him from Americans by either cutting military or intelligence support for Ukraine. Now, that $23 billion number sounds a little more impressive than it actually is. I think about $14 billion of that money is supposed to come from Germany, and a lot of those weapons aren't going to reach the battlefield until 2028 or 2029, so years down the road. But when coming up with this package and putting this all together, the German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, explained that we don't think the Russians are serious about negotiations, and this is to show the Russians that we are committed to this proxy war for 3, 4, 5 years down the road. Now, I have one more article here that I want to bring up. This one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on April 13th. Russia, Ukraine continue to trade accusations of ceasefire violations. And this is just important to show that all of Trump's diplomatic efforts so far when it comes to Ukraine haven't really netted anything whatsoever. Now, the Russians are saying that the bilateral talks between the U.S. and Russia aimed at restoring a diplomatic relationship between Moscow and Washington have progressed, but there hasn't been any real progress when it comes to the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, as both sides continue to violate the ceasefire deals that they had agreed to. All right, everybody. With that, I am going to wrap up. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. If you are listening live on that, head on over to the YouTube channel and subscribe to the show. Give us suggestions for future guests. Ask questions. Leave us a comment. We always appreciate it. We are live every Monday and Wednesday at 4:45 Eastern. We'll see you on Wednesday.